So moving forward into kind of the heart of this first session, vulnerability and compassion. Compassion is perhaps one of the strongest practices that we have in Buddhadharma, because compassion is really this kind of liberatory force that moves us into the suffering of the world, and it moves us into the suffering of the world in a really creative, dynamic way. And the heart of compassion is really empathy. And empathy, in this case, really begins with connecting to our sense of suffering. Because ultimately what compassion is defined as is the wish to alleviate suffering in the world, in individuals, in ourselves. So to begin that practice, we use our practice of mindfulness to actually locate and connect to our sense of suffering within our own experience. Now, suffering is a very complex and difficult word to work with, and so I often say that suffering is really about a feeling of not being okay, a feeling of being uneasy, a feeling of kind of being off. And I really encourage you in your practice to kind of name how suffering manifests for you in your life. Suffering can be a very huge word and a hugely complicated kind of concept. But how do you feel in life? Think about the anxiety, think about the discomfort that you feel in certain situations. We think about moving into the world and placing ourselves within situations that are very difficult, placing ourselves as mediators in acts of violence, placing ourselves in certain other conflicts, having to come to terms with certain parts of our own identities that actually may create suffering for others around us. So we're talking about racialized identity, we're talking about class identity, we're talking about gender identities, and the kinds of power and violence that comes out of those identities. So we're bringing a mindfulness to that discomfort. And because we identify with our own discomfort, we say, well, I'm experiencing this. Whatever kind of discomfort I am going through this, I'm experiencing this. And I wonder if other people are experiencing the same things. Now, I actually wonder if people like me, who I perceive as being very similar to me, I wonder if they're going through the same thing that I'm going through. And then from that kind of contemplation, our reflection actually moves from inside, and we actually start relating to the world, the outside world, from our own internal environment. And that's when we begin to develop compassion, when we say that, well, I think other people are experiencing discomfort in the world, and I don't want to experience discomfort. I'm sure others don't want to experience discomfort. So maybe I want to wish that all beings, including myself, that all beings are freed from their suffering and from their discomfort. And that really is the beginning of compassion there. That is when compassion begins to take root in our experience, when we actually begin to consider the experiences of other people. So the vulnerability piece actually is really important here, because we have to have a sense of openness. And vulnerability, in my practice, is defined as this willingness to hold space for the experiences that come up for me. And not only am I holding space for my experiences, I am actually acknowledging those experiences. And that's vulnerability. And that initial practice of vulnerability is very personal, it's very internalized. And so, but that's critical to start with. When we're developing, for instance, compassion, we begin to think about our own experiences. So the development of empathy for ourselves, and that's really vulnerability. So when we begin to say, oh, I am having these experiences, and we begin to look at everything that comes up around those experiences, For instance, one of the things that I work with in my practice is around sexuality. And so I identify as a queer man. And so in my development and understanding of my own sexuality, it was so important for me years ago to actually come out to myself. And that was really a practice of vulnerability. That was also the beginning root of compassion. Even though I couldn't name that as a young man, now I can look back and say, oh, when I came out to myself, when I admitted that I was actually attracted to other men, that was the beginning of holding space for my experience of sexuality. And then from that, I was able to hold the experiences of the shame, the fear, the regret, the sadness, and also the joy, the sense of freedom, the sense of openness. All that began to arise, I began to hold the space for that. And that space began to deepen and widen more and more. And I began to connect more and more to everything that was coming up. And then eventually I was able to say, this is my experience of being a gay man or a queer man. And so other people like me may be experiencing the same range of things coming up. So that was the vulnerability, and that was also the compassion piece. So we have to have an honesty when we're practicing vulnerability. We can't give rise to compassion if we're not honest about the reality of our own suffering. And we will not connect to the suffering of others if we're not connecting and honest about our own suffering and discomfort.